Hi, I'm Alan and this is Prayers to the Dice Gods, and today we're going to be looking at how to clean our airbrushes so that we don't get any blocks from our airflow, and so of course we can carry on painting. So what are we going to need to do this cleaning? Now I'm looking to do quite a deep clean on the airbrush today because I've not done it in a while. Admittedly I've not used the airbrush as much as I usually would, but still it's good to do. So we're going to need an airbrush cleaning kit, which includes some wires, some wire brushes, a little spiky tool. We're also going to need some airbrush cleaner, a small pot, some tissue. One of the things that I've found while airbrushing is that you can get a blockage that kind of runs anywhere from the front of your airbrush all the way back to the trigger. You get a paint build-up. What happens is the paint seeps back through your needle and then can build up behind it. Now it leaves just enough space for the needle to go in and out, but not enough for your airflow to go. So you might steadily notice that the airflow is decreasing as a result of this paint build-up. The first thing we're going to want to do here, obviously, is dismantle the airbrush. Now, these things aren't half as scary as you think they are. You just need to be that little bit careful with things like your needle and the tip, because you can shear the bottom screw off quite easily. As I'm taking it apart, you can actually see a paint build-up on certain parts on the inside, which are actually around the trigger, which shows you just how far back that paint can actually seep to. So I really like the wires that came with the cleaning kit because they fit down where the needle's been. Now the main point for that is it'll help me clear any blockages. My airbrush is actually pretty clean at the minute, which I was quite surprised at when I started doing this. But what I do is I start with the smallest one of the wires and I'll push that through the hole in an attempt to catch any paint on the other side. Now normally when I do this I work my way up, which I'm doing here, but you'll usually see a big chunk of paint that will suddenly fall out. The way to tell that you've got a blockage there without being able to see it is actually starting with the smallest one. If you find there's a lot of resistance in getting that in, then that usually means there's a paint build up there. This helps you if you start building up until you hit about the same size as the needle and then you find that it's going in and out pretty easily, then you've cleared that blockage. Next up, we're just going to get some airbrush cleaner. We're going to stick that onto a little bit of tissue and then we're going to gently clean that needle. Now we don't want to cause any damage here. If you start running that needle back and forth when you're towards the tip, you can bend it and completely ruin it. So we're just going to gently go up that needle and occasionally back down, trying to avoid hitting that tip, but getting off as much of the paint that's left on there as possible. Some bits are easier to clean than others. Now we tackle that with our little spiky tool. It helps to just start to dislodge it so that when we start putting on our airbrush cleaner on our bit of tissue, it starts to work its way underneath and helps to just lift that off. With a little bit of extra rubbing, it tends to clean it off pretty well. Using the small pot, we're going to fill that with some airbrush cleaner and just submerge some of the parts in there because the paint has been stuck on them for a little while and this will just help dislodge that. So we're going to work our way through. We will give them a quick clean every now and then resubmerge them to make sure that we can get all of that paint off. If you like the video, be sure to click on the like button because I know there's some pesky orcs around here somewhere looking to destroy it before you get a chance to click it. Using our brush tools, we're going to dip those into our little pot and then use them to clean the bottom end of our airbrush cup. Now, though I clean my airbrush after every use, I still tend to find that I get a paint build up at the bottom because I do wipe out the cup, but I can't quite get in there, especially with the needle in the way. And I've noticed that it's got some build up there of chunks of paint, which will, if left, work towards impeding the air and paint flow of my airbrush. Because I didn't just want to scratch out the bottom of my airbrush cup, I decided to grab some cotton buds and we're just going to keep dipping them into our pot and rubbing down the inside until we can clear as much of that paint that's left down there as possible. And obviously we're going to scratch out any chunks that are in there and any bits along the edge that we just can't get to with the cotton bud. Grabbing the trusty tweezers, we're going to start pulling items out of the pot, giving them their first little rub down just with a bit of tissue to see how much of that paint we can get back off, and where necessary we're going to use a tool to try and get that off, or we're going to resubmerge it for a little bit longer inside that pot, and that is going to get those parts really nice and clean. It turns out the toughest bit to clean that seemed to have the biggest amount of paint buildup is actually the tip where the needle goes in. Now that seemed to have a great deal in. I had to go through a few different ways to clean that out, but what seemed to work best was to try and do that inside the pot of airbrush cleaner. Now the last few steps are pretty straightforward. It's put the airbrush back together. Now don't do what I did, which was forget that I dropped the spring on the floor and then spend much longer than I want to admit wondering why the airbrush wouldn't go back together properly and wouldn't work. I did eventually realise that I dropped that spring onto the floor found it and put the airbrush together properly. The last thing that I do with that is I then fill the cup with a bit of water just to give it a quick rinse through to make sure that we've got out any parts of any chunks of paint that maybe didn't come out of the airbrush. And there it is, a beautifully clean airbrush ready to be used again. I absolutely love this tool and I have absolutely no issues with it because of the way I maintain it. I would love to hear about your issues with your airbrushes or your fears about investing in an airbrush to get started. If you leave those in the comments, we can have a really good chat about those. Now, I absolutely love my airbrush. My airbrush can be considered to be a low-end airbrush. It does everything. I tend to run it on a really low air pressure, so I like to thin my paints a bit more than maybe some of the other airbrushes do. But I find that this works really well for me and I can airbrush for a good couple of hours without having too many issues. You know, of course, there is the occasional dry tip, which we just solve with a damp brush. Run around the tip, that fixes that problem really quickly. I don't get any airflow blocks, I don't get any paint blockages because I follow these steps to make sure that my airbrush has a nice clean channel from front to back.